We warmly welcome you to our annual Ruderman program, which in this extraordinary year will be an extended set of explorations through a series of events on the colors and cultures of the Jews. Tonight's conversation with Professors Eric Goldstein and Cabria Baumgartner on the price of whiteness, Jews, race, and American identity is the first of two collaborative programs that we have folded into the open classroom. The topic for this semester of which is Repairing a Divided America, Race, Hate Crimes, and Reconciliation. Co-taught and organized by my good friends and fabulous colleagues, Professor Ted Landsmark and Jonathan Kaufman, who have created a perfect intellectual and public context for tonight's conversation and have graciously yielded the MC role to me this evening. I am Lori Lefkowitz, Ruderman Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of the Jewish Studies Program and the Humanities Center here at Northeastern University. In a few minutes, I will introduce our topic and tonight's speakers. But first, some important words of gratitude. The Northeastern University Jewish Studies Program is perennially appreciative of the Ruderman Family Foundation for their reliable support of our efforts to offer meaningful and timely programming for the Northeastern University and greater Boston communities. And in recent years, with the support of technology, to a much more widespread audience, which this evening is very large and far-reaching. This topic clearly resonates. For a decade now, I have invoked my own warm and very sweet memories of Morton E. Ruderman on this memorial occasion, grateful that we can honor the life of someone whose dedication to helping Jewish studies flourish at Northeastern has had such long-lasting and powerful impact on our program. Morton Ruderman was a wonderful person with a big heart, a 1959 graduate of our School of Engineering, a co-founder of Meditech, and with his spouse Marcia, a philanthropist whose generosity has played a formidable role in the growth and success of Jewish studies at his alma mater. That legacy is honored by the Ruderman Family Foundation, and we are very happy to see Morton and Marcia's children, Jay and Sharon in the back here, who are here with us tonight in person. To them and those who are joining remotely, Brother Todd Ruderman, Foundation Executive Director Shira Ruderman, and the Foundation staff, especially Chana Shaul Bar Nisim, I want to publicly say how much we value our conversations and strong relationship with the Foundation, and how grateful we are to you for the important work you do, not only for us, but in your advocacy for inclusion and for support of productive relationships between the Israeli and American Jewish communities. We thank you. I want to thank the administrators of Jewish Studies and the Humanities Center, Deborah Levison-Stanhill and Gabrielle Fiorenza-Hagopian, respectively, for making everything that we do possible. And I want to thank my partner in all things Jewish Studies, Professor Simon Rabinovich, whose vision and personal friendship with Eric Goldstein shaped tonight's event. Finally, Jewish Studies and the Humanities Center, both of which co-sponsor tonight's program, benefit from the support of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities under the strong leadership of our Dean, Uta Poiger, who is here tonight and will offer her own brief words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Lori, and it's a great pleasure to see all of you in person here and also to welcome our audience that is joining us via Zoom. The open classroom, of course, a classroom that the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs has run as a classroom that is designed for members of the Northeastern community, as well as for members of Boston and neighboring towns. And so it's always a great pleasure to come to the Open Classroom, and it's a special pleasure for me to be here tonight. The theme for this semester in the Open Classroom, Repairing a Divided America, was born in the context of the national and international reckoning in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the murders in Atlanta, the movements of Black Lives Matter and the movement against AAPI hate, also in the wake of January 6th, and continued efforts to restrict voting rights as well as other rights. Tonight is a special example of our interdisciplinary collaborations that help address these questions. Let me express my gratitude for the partnership that the Open Classroom and today's program with the Ruderman Lecture represent. Many thanks to Ted Landsmark and to Jonathan Kaufman. Many thanks to the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and the School of Journalism, the College of Social Sciences and Humanities and the College of Arts, Media and Design, and to Jewish Studies and the Humanities Center, especially Lori Lefkowitz and Simon Rabinovich. It is really collaboration and attention to the multifaceted nature of racism and of resistance against it, as well as thriving in spite of racism, that need to guide the path ahead. One of my roles at Northeastern University is co-chairing the Presidential Council on Diversity and Inclusion, and the Open Classroom and Ruderman Lecture collaboration are certainly part of our work in moving diversity and also a sense of belonging forward at Northeastern and together with the communities that surround our campuses. You can probably hear from my accent that I was raised in Germany, the country that in collaboration with other Europeans was responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews during World War II and the Nazi occupation of large swaths of Europe. It was the experience of coming to the United States and for the first time realizing that I was being seen as white that made it clear to me how context-specific and historically contingent understandings of race and often also of racism are. Ultimately, my path led me to research racial formations and comparative frameworks through cultural history. As a historian of racial and gender formations, both in Europe and the United States, I'm particularly proud of today's Open Classroom and Ruderman program and really look forward to the interview that Cabria Baumgartner will conduct with Eric Goldstein. Let me add my special thanks to the Ruderman Family Foundation for making such creative partnerships of the interviewers as well as of the organizations that are working together possible and supporting us in bringing guests who enrich our conversations. These important conversations deepen learning, and they encourage us to think and act in ways that foster positive change. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean Poiger. As Dean Poiger said, on global, national, and local levels, in these last few years, we have been reeling from disruptions, losses, and abuses so manifestly egregious that they have become difficult to ignore. If some positive change may come from our collective heartbreak, perhaps the varieties of reckonings that we are engaging in may prove fruitful starting places, including the reckonings that are happening in this classroom. So when the university encouraged us to have a cold, hard look at our curricula, syllabi, and pedagogy with attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion, the Jewish Studies program saw, most obviously, the need to address gaps in our own representation of Jewish people of color, the histories and cultures of global Jewish communities of color, and the sheer diversity of expressions of Jewishness across time and place. Contemporary Jewish identity carries the legacy of an endlessly complex history.
Jews do not fit neatly into categories that we may think we understand. Are Jews a race, an ethnicity, a religious group, a people, a nation? Race-based hatred of Jews has had, of course, as Dean Poyger said, genocidal consequences, and anti-Semitism in many permutations still thrives. That said, many of us take Jewish whiteness and the white privilege and obligations of such privilege for granted. Tonight's conversation between two distinguished American historians who have focused their work on questions of race is meant to help us theorize the very concept of race by attending to race as an historically contingent phenomenon. What has it meant to be Jewish in a nation organized around the categories of black and white? These are questions that Professor Goldstein offers us. Are the descendants of European Jews in the United States a minority group or part of the privileged majority? Our invited guest is Professor Eric Goldstein. I'm a longtime fan of Professor Goldstein's work, whose work has traced the complicated history of the Jews' encounter with American racial culture from the beginning of mass Jewish immigration in the 19th century to the recent protest movements for racial justice. Eric L. Goldstein is Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, where he is also Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies. He's the author of the book from which we took the title for tonight's program, The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2006, and with Deborah R. Weiner on Middle Ground, A History of the Jews of Baltimore, published by the Johns Hopkins University Press in 2018. From 2007 to 2012, he was the editor of the scholarly journal American Jewish History. Professor Goldstein will be interviewed by our new colleague at Northeastern, Cabria Baumgartner. Professor Baumgartner is an historian of the 19th century United States. She specializes in history of education, African American women's and gender history, and the New England region. She's the author of the award-winning book, In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women and Educational Activism in Antebellum America, which was published by New York University Press in 2019. It tells the story of Black girls and women who fought for their educational rights in the 19th century Northeast. Her research has been supported by the Spencer Foundation, the National Academy of Education, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. Professor Baumgartner has also published numerous scholarly articles and book chapters, and her popular writing has been featured in the Washington Post, WBUR's Cognoscenti, and Historic New England magazine. She is now working on a new book about the history of civil rights in 19th century Boston. I am thrilled to welcome Professor Baumgartner as a new colleague and very grateful that she took time from what I know is a precious leave to be with us this evening. So this is the moment when I ask Professors Goldstein and Baumgartner to please take seats up front and begin our conversation. Thank you.
All right, good evening. Good evening. Good evening. I join Professor Lefkowitz and Dean Poyger in welcoming you all here. Thank you to our audience online, joining us through Zoom, and of course, all of you in the room. I also share their opening remarks. I'm honored to be here and to be in conversation with Professor Goldstein. And I just want to dive right in. I've got quite a few questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can, and then we'll open it up to the audience. All right, so maybe before we get into the book, The Price of Whiteness, I thought it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this fascinating research.
First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here with you, Capriya, and thank the folks in the Jewish Studies program, and thank Ted Lansmark and Jonathan Kaufman for inviting us into their classroom, Dean Poiger and Deborah Levinson Stanhill, who've made all the arrangements, so thank you all for your warm welcome. Okay, so a little bit about how I got into this project. Here's sort of our opening frame. This work came out of being a historian who has attempted to be at the intersection of Jewish history and U.S. history, and trying to bring together the two somewhat different narratives of those two historical fields. I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan back in the early 90s, and can you hear? How's that? Much better. Okay. Okay. So as I was saying, this project, this research came out of being a historian that stands sort of at the intersection of two historical fields: modern Jewish history and U.S. history, and they're fields that have somewhat different narratives about difference and minorities. I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in the early 90s, and because there weren't very many Jewish historians there, the introductory course that I was placed in was the U.S. history course. And it was immediately obvious that race, especially conceived in the black-white divide, was really one of the key, if not the key narrative of the course, and something that ran through almost every work that we read. And as someone who was interested in the history of American Jews, I struggled somewhat to figure out, where did Jews fit in all of this? And on the one hand, I understood that, this was a small group and that Jews didn't really make a big impact on the narrative of U.S. history as it's been written. But at the same time, I wanted to figure out how to place them. And so that was something that caused me to think about, okay, how do Jews fit into this larger narrative about race in the United States and difference? And around that time, there were some works coming out about this, what we'll talk about in a minute, the social construction of whiteness, particularly works by David Roediger and some other related historians. And David Roediger is a labor historian, and he wrote some interesting works about the Irish in the United States and how they, quote unquote, became white. And this was a very interesting topic to me, and I was immediately thinking, okay, is there a similar story about Jews coming to this country as immigrants and then coming to sort of think of themselves and be considered part of the white population? So that's sort of how I got into this topic.
Right, I do remember that the field of whiteness studies, which has been part of the historical discipline, but also really connected to anthropology, right? So there's a lot of interesting work there. So in the book, you describe whiteness as a skin color and a cultural identity that was learned by Jews and was assigned to them by dominant society. You point out that a group can, in one situation, be seen as or define themselves as white, and in the another situation, perhaps not. So can you talk more about this?
Yes. So this is what I mean when I refer to this whiteness as a social construction, right? I think a lot of us in everyday discourse, and people in the general public, we tend to take these categories that are, that shape our world for granted, and I think most people think of racial differences as kind of these matter-of-fact differences that have to do with skin color and appearance. But the trend in the historical profession and the academy for the last few decades has been to move toward thinking of racial categories as socially constructed, meaning that they're kind of cultural categories that have less to do with matter-of-fact, certainly scientific differences, and more to do with cultural perceptions, and that they're historically situated, meaning that they change depending on the circumstances. They change upon in relationship to the different set of cultural, social, economic, political circumstances in which an individual finds themselves. And it makes sense that immigrants have figured largely in these histories that have been written over the last few decades of racial construction, particularly of whiteness, for the reasons that Dean Poyger mentioned in her introduction, which is that immigrants as people who move from one social and cultural setting to another are, really help illustrate how in one setting you can think of yourself and be seen by others in one way, and then in another setting in the United States, you can find yourself in a totally different set of categories and circumstances. So in the Jewish case, you have a situation where the vast majority of Jews who came to the United States before World War II were European in origin, and they mostly came from certain areas of the world, such as Germany or the states that preceded Germany before its unification in the 19th century. And then later, toward the end of the 19th and early 20th century, they came from mostly the Russian Empire. And in those places, they were often the primary outsider group in their society. So whiteness was not necessarily a relevant identity for them in the places that they came from. One was a Jew, or perhaps a German, or a Jew or a Russian, and they were used to thinking of themselves as the primary outsider group. And then coming to the United States, where there was a different history, a different set of historical circumstances, a history of colonization, of westward expansion, of a history that divided people into black and white, or in a broader sense, white and different people of color. And so that was the cultural scene which they entered, and they were both sort of slotted into those categories by others. And then as they came to think of themselves as American, part of that was coming to understand themselves as white, and also strive to be seen as white by other Americans, because they came to understand that was essential to become, to be seen as part of the dominant class in America. So that's what I mean by race as a kind of culturally constructed category.
Thank you. As I was reading, and I would say rereading, because I remember reading your book in graduate school, but as I was coming back to it for this interview, I was looking at the introduction where you talk about the aim of your book, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it. So this is on page 5. Instead of facing the rejection of whites who were uncertain about Jewish racial status, Jews after 1965 encountered growing rejection by African Americans, who often challenged their right to present themselves as a persecuted minority. After a century, Jews were still struggling with the constraints of the black-white dichotomy. For reasons such as these, I've chosen not to frame this book as a study of how Jews became white, but as one that explores how Jews negotiated their place in a complex racial world where Jewishness, whiteness, and blackness have all made significant claims on them. And I was really struck by this passage in the introduction. And I was wondering if you can talk more about this process of negotiation and acculturation.
Right. So, on the one hand, Jewish immigrants did go through a process by which they came to be considered white and came to understand themselves as white. But the language that was used in a lot of the books that I was influenced by, like David Roediger, for example, I felt that they described this process in too simplistic of terms, that it was a kind of linear process where one went from being some sort of despised outsider, whether it was an Irish immigrant or a Jewish immigrant, to becoming white. And it's as if one identity replaced the other. And in my work, I tried to grapple with that a little bit and understand it as a messier process, and one that wasn't necessarily linear, and that even in coming to understand oneself as white, there were still continued to be complicating factors. And also that that one could, even after that, there were times when one could still be seen as an outsider, and so it was much more complicated. I have some images here that I think will illustrate, that this is an ongoing process. First of all, this opening slide that has this very unusual collection of heads, of bodiless heads. This is actually the cabinet of President Theodore Roosevelt, right, who was president in the early 20th century. And it's from the cover of my book. On the cover, though, the third person from the front, the very first person is Theodore Roosevelt. The third person is Oscar Strauss, who was a Jew of German parentage. His parents were immigrants from Germany, came to the US in the 1840s or 50s. And he was one of the first Jews to serve in a cabinet level position. And this photo was staged by Roosevelt very intentionally to make a point about assimilation. He very consciously appointed a Jew and at least one Catholic and people of diverse European backgrounds to his cabinet. He did a similar thing with his troop that he led up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. And it was to make a point about a kind of America being a melting pot, and that no matter what background you came from, and again, he was only referring to European immigrants, that they were all be forged into Americans, by which he meant white Americans. And this photo was staged in a way to make the same point, that he was lining up these people of what he considered diverse backgrounds, but he was the intention was to show they all look alike, they are all the same, to emphasize this melting pot idea. And I always thought that Strauss looks a little uneasy there. He's like being blended in here, but he's maybe a little unsure that he wants to be too blended. Okay, and then I'm going to warn you, the next slide is a jarring slide of a picture of Leo Frank, who was a Jew who was lynched in the South in 1915. So I just want to warn you before I show this picture. And here is so the first slide, you have this Jew who was kind of being integrated, being melted into this white American melting pot. And then you have this very contrary image of Leo Frank, who I don't know if you all know the background of this, but he was a somewhat assimilated Jew living in Atlanta, my hometown. And in 1913, he was accused of raping and murdering a young white factory worker, a young girl in the factory where he was the manager. And his whole, the illusion sort of, it turned out to be an illusion that he was part of this German Jewish community in Atlanta who thought that they were very well integrated, very respected, very accepted. And then he became the focus of this anti-Semitic trial, which placed the blame on him for this murder, along with the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes. And from the perspective of, Atlanta was, of course, a Jim Crow city where there was very strict segregation between African Americans and whites. And, the Jewish population was trying very hard to be accepted on the white side of the divide. And then one of their most, sort of shining stars is lynched in this episode in 1915. And it was sort of, they came to understand that they were, at the very best, conditional whites, that one of their own was given the same treatment that was usually reserved for African Americans in that society. So it shows you kind of that it's not a linear thing, that there are ebbs and flows, and that whiteness was an unstable identity for Jews. Just a couple more examples. This is a very different context. This is a cartoon from a Yiddish publication. Yiddish was the language that East European Jews spoke and brought with them to this country at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And this is actually from a humor magazine around the period of 1910. So this is a somewhat different population of Jews, new immigrants still speaking a foreign language, and yet they're observing the American racial scene. And the perspective of this cartoon is somewhat of outsiders who don't yet think of themselves as part of the white population, and they're kind of observing how they see in the African American experience some resonances of the way they were treated in Russia as victims of pogroms, of riots, and different types of racial violence. And so they're sort of critiquing the white rhetoric of the time. They show the picture on the top of a white man attacking an African American man, and the subtitle says civilization. This is what white people call civilization, when the white people are attacking the black people. But when the black man is attacking the white man in the very same, the opposite position, it's called barbarism. So, there's this lofty rhetoric about civilization versus barbarism. They say, well, the only difference is it's when the white people attack the black people, it's civilization. But when the black people attack the white people, it's barbarism. So this is an outsider's perspective of someone who doesn't think they're really part of this. And yet you can see, however, that the depiction of the African American man draws on a kind of racist, minstrelsy imagery, where his mouth is painted white. So even in this outsider stance, they're already absorbing some of the stereotypes and things that white people had, again, regarding blacks. So you see that, they have different positions depending on the context. And then this is addressed to the same audience about two decades later, in the 1920s or early 30s. It's an advertisement in the Jewish Daily Forward, which is a Yiddish newspaper for Jewish immigrants. And yet, by the 20s and 30s, they're in the position of becoming middle class and really starting to integrate into American culture. So this is essentially a national advertisement, an advertisement for Does soap, like a dishwashing soap, that this same ad with the same pictures would have appeared in English newspapers, but when it ran in the Forward, they translated it to Yiddish. And essentially what you see here is immigrants being kind of educated with the idea that, well, if you want to be a middle-class white person in America, like the people depicted in the ad, this little girl who is being, tended to by an African-American nanny, it's sort of an image that's put out there. This is what it means to be a middle-class, upwardly mobile white person. And yet it's all in Yiddish, right? So it's sort of, you can see the process through which these immigrants are learning these codes of white Americanism through popular culture. And that this is the image of what it means to be someone of status and success and middle class. And then the final image this is just to show why I say negotiation rather than a kind of linear development. This is one of the most successful Jewish individuals in the United States. This is around 1915, Julius Rosenwald. He's on the left side. He was the owner of the Sears Roebuck Company in Chicago. He didn't found it, but he bought it. And Sears, I don't know if young people know today what Sears even is, but it was a huge sort of a department store, but they had a catalog and you could order just about anything from it. It was one of the biggest, commercial developments in the United States. And Rosenwald became a philanthropist, and unlike most white philanthropists, he focused a lot of his philanthropy on African-American educational institutions. He supported black YMCA and YWCAs across the country. And the most significant thing is across the South, he contributed to the building of thousands of small schoolhouses, usually one-room schoolhouses in southern communities that had no schools available for African Americans. And here he's with Booker T. Washington. My sense is that what I would say is that as Jews came to think of themselves as white, it was always inflected by other identities, particularly their Jewishness. And those two things could interact in different ways depending on where they were in the integration process. And so if you were a new immigrant striving to identify as white, you might be attracted by some of the other, in some of the other ways that we've seen. But Rosenwald was already so integrated and successful. What you see is he doesn't really care so much about being seen as white because he takes that for granted already. And so here you see he is sort of, to him, what it means to be Jewish is to reach out to African Americans and show empathy and show support for another minority group. But ironically, that is not a symbol of his marginalization. It shows he's so well accepted into the white community that now he can safely express that aspect of his identity. So it's not like becoming white doesn't mean becoming more and more racist. It's complicated in this way, where in some ways this empathy that grows out of having a Jewish background only can be safely expressed once he was safely integrated into the white population. So it takes all of these different directions, and rather than going in this linear fashion, it's this constant negotiation depending on the circumstances, depending on the level of integration and other factors.
I think that's such a salient point about this process of negotiation. I was struck by your analysis of the Leo Frank case, and I just wanted to kind of go back to that and connect it to this question that I have. The defense in that case actually used these racist stereotypes in his defense, and they were encouraged to downplay Leo Frank's Jewishness, right, during the trial. So this made me think, this process of acculturation, this process of negotiation, what implication did this have for the relationship between Jews and people of color, right? We do have this Booker T. Washington example, but it's so complex. So what are the implications of this?
Right. So, you know, there is a long historiography about what has been called Black-Jewish relations, and it is very historically significant that Jews, probably more than any other white ethnic group, have there are many examples in their history of positive relations with African Americans, and probably more Jews than members of other white groups, have supported things like the civil rights movement. But what I found in my research is that they're very particular Jews who did those things, and I'll describe in a minute what types of Jews, for example, Rosenwald, it was because of the particular position he was in that made that type of activism sort of available to him. But what I found looking at a wide swath of different types of Jews is that there was no one, being Jewish did not mean that there was one predictable approach that these people took toward African Americans. Like I said, it depended on the circumstance. So it depended if you were a new immigrant, if how secure you felt in your acceptance in American society. Those examples of the Leo Frank case, where in trying to prove their client innocent, sometimes his legal team fell back on stereotypes about African Americans. One of the other main suspects in the case was an African American janitor who worked in the factory. So they fastened on the widespread belief in that setting that African Americans were rapists, and all these things came up in the trial as a way of trying to prove him. So in that vulnerable moment, they appealed to these racial assumptions. But as you see in a very different setting where that wasn't a concern, and someone like Rosenwald felt very at ease with their acceptance as white, then other sentiments could come out. So I think there was this tension among many Jews between, on the one hand, the desire to fit in, and then on the other hand, a feeling that being Jewish was different, and there was a different, maybe moral or ethical legacy. And those things were present in many individuals, but the particular mix, came out differently, and one maybe overrode the other depending on the circumstance.
Can you talk a little bit about the different segments of the Jewish community then in thinking about this process of acculturation and negotiation?
Before I do that, I want to also mention something which we've left out, which is that my work combines two different questions, which is, on the one hand, you have this shaped an approach to African Americans, but the other thing that differed according to circumstance was then how Jews defined what it meant to be Jewish. For example, Lori was mentioning that in different times and situations, Jews have defined themselves as a race, as a people, as a religious group, and part of what happened with these different cases, as Jews felt that they needed to identify as white, it also inflected how they defined Jewishness in different cases. So it's sort of a lost concept today, but up until World War II, Jews very often defined themselves in racial terms. They would speak of the Jewish race. They would laud their group's achievements by describing them as kind of innate racial qualities. But at the same time, that in some contexts, that became a very dangerous way of describing themselves. And so there, as these different approaches to African Americans were going on, they were paralleled by debates within the Jewish community about how Jews should define themselves and whether defining themselves in racial terms suggested that maybe they weren't fully white. And so there were some people who said, that being accepted as white meant Jews just had to define themselves as a religious group. So these pictures are from a book, by an anthropologist, a Jewish doctor who was an anthropologist named Maurice Fishberg. He published a book in 1911 called The Jews, A Study of Race and Environment. And he set out to make the claim that Jews, in a sense, he didn't use this language, but he was setting out to prove the Jews were white, and by saying that they weren't a distinct racial group. And he used, like a lot of scientists of the period, he used these racial types, these photographs, and he basically came to the conclusion that Jews were related racially to all over the world to whatever group they lived among, that they weren't a coherent racial group. But Jews who lived in Africa were African, but Jews who came from Europe, where most American Jews came from, were racially related to the people among whom they lived. And part of proving his point was he produced these pictures of the so-called American Jew, and just coincidentally, they're dressed in military uniforms and plumed hats to, emphasize how they look like middle-class white Americans. The interesting thing is he was, I think he believed he was doing this great service to the Jewish community by proving that they belonged and that they would assimilate. But he became very controversial because although most Jews, I think in the United States, wanted to be accepted as white, they weren't willing to go to the conclusion that Fishberg was, which was that they weren't a distinct racial group, because to many Jews, denying that meant that they weren't a people, that they didn't have this shared heritage. There was no language of ethnicity the way we have today. And so he was attacked in the Jewish press for being a traitor and denying his Jewish identity. So it shows how complicated the internal Jewish politics was that went along with this politics of how one relates to whiteness and to African Americans. Sorry, so I didn't mean to preempt your other question. So remind me what?
It's about the segments and different types.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, I've mentioned that a lot of these positions depended on, what type of a Jew you were, where you were in the integration process. But there were many different factors that could shape that. So I mentioned German Jews who came in the 19th century. And then I mentioned Eastern European Jews who came at the end of the 19th and in the early 20th century. So these were groups that acculturated at different times, right? So by the time that a lot of these issues became a big concern at the turn of the 20th century, German Jews were highly acculturated, like Rosenwald. So they were in a different place than these new immigrants, like the ones who were reading those Yiddish publications. So, those groups often approach these issues in a very different way. And say German Jews were much more likely to define themselves only as a religious group and to be much more knowledgeable and careful about racial etiquette. And the newer Eastern European Jews were often much less aware of, one hears stories about a Jewish peddler in the South who was, say, a Russian Jew who was off on his first peddling trip, and a lot of his customers in the rural South were African-American farmers, and he would stay overnight on their farm and eat with them, and then he would come back to the place where there was a Jewish community, and he would tell them his experiences, and they would sort of school him and say, down here, people don't, you want to integrate into the larger non-Jewish population, there's certain rules, and he would learn the racial etiquette of the region. So a newer immigrant was less aware of these things. So one factor is, which wave of immigration, where was an individual on the path of integration? Regionalism was obviously a big factor. So Jews in the North had a different approach to these issues than Jews in the South, and at the turn of the century, for example, when there were different riots, like there was in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, there was an attack on the black community. And this was something that was discussed in the Jewish press. And one of the interesting things was that in the North, Jews more naturally saw a parallel between this and what was going on among Russian Jews in Eastern Europe, who were victims of pogroms. And they would say, this is horrible. This is just like what's happening to Jews. But then Southern Jews would find that not a good parallel because they didn't want their neighbors to think of them like African Americans. So the Southern papers would write in response and say, no, that, and there would be a debate about this. So regionalism was clearly a big thing. And also, thinking about Rosenwald, one of the factors was the Jews who were the most able to express a sense of empathy and similarity and shared experience on some level with African Americans were Jews who, for one reason or another, didn't feel as much social pressure to conform. So that could be very wealthy Jews like Rosenwald, who just were beyond feeling the pressure of fitting in because they had really made it. But also one finds that certain other groups like rabbis, so a lot of the activists who were in the Jewish community who were supportive of African American education and civil rights were clergy. And so it causes one to think about, well, what is it about a rabbi? It's been expressed in this way, which is members of the general Jewish community were often business people. They relied on the approval of the non-Jewish population for their livelihood. But a rabbi was in some ways released from that pressure because he worked for the Jewish community. He didn't feel that pressure in the same way. And also, I think it was expected for clergy to maybe sometimes take moral positions that the average person wouldn't take. So it makes sense that would be a group. Women sometimes were more, it seems that there were more Jewish women who were active in civil rights than men. And so one asks the same question, and I think you could have the similar answer, which is that because in American society, women were not often in public roles as business people or politicians and they were more confined to the Jewish community and to maybe domestic roles, although of course not in every case, but that it opened up a little more freedom for them to express opinions that weren't maybe the ideas of the dominant culture. And then of course there was a significant radical community within the Jewish community. And I think just by the very definition, they supported more revolutionary politics, Jewish communists, Jewish socialists. So that's another. So there are these very specific groups within the Jewish community who articulated these views, but that shouldn't necessarily be confused with being the view of the entire Jewish community.
It's not a monolithic community, right? So you hinted at this when you talked about the experience of Jews in the 19th century and then pre-World War II moving into later part of the 20th century. How do you think Jews' encounter with whiteness changed over time?
Right. So you sort of have to follow the pattern of American Jewish history. There was a sort of process of integration, acculturation, and because there were these different waves of immigration, a lot of times, the earlier wave integrated, but then this massive wave of East European Jews came, and then, the social position of Jews was somewhat set back. But in the period of the interwar years, the 20s and 30s, that group of immigrants started to achieve a kind of middle-class status, but there was kind of a pushback against that, and that actually becomes the period of the high point of anti-Semitism in the United States. There were a lot of quotas against Jews in colleges, private clubs, all kinds of not only social discrimination, but really, I guess today what we would call structural discrimination, like housing discrimination, employment discrimination against Jews, educational discrimination. But World War II was a watershed, and part of it has to do with the war effort, that there was an effort by the Roosevelt administration to really forge the American, at least the white American population and those who were serving in the armed forces into a coherent fighting force and a home front, and to challenge different forms of discrimination, because they felt that there was Nazi propaganda that was promoting, grievances among different groups. And so there was all this this kind of campaign during World War II about, Americans all, and stressing that people were contributing to American society from diverse backgrounds. Again, it usually focused on white immigrant populations. But World War II was a time when Jews became much, much more fully integrated and accepted into the white mainstream. And then with the economic boom after the war, a lot of the social anxieties and economic problems that had promoted anti-Semitism disappeared. And in the kind of prosperity and optimism of the post-war period, Jews achieved a really high level of social integration. They moved to the suburbs. They were able to enter professions in large numbers, experienced a great deal of upward mobility. And so Jews become kind of a part of white America in a way that they had been unable to in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s. So there is this kind of progression of becoming more of a part of white America and coming to be accepted as white, but, like I was saying before, it's not that simple. They still struggled with these categories of black and white in different ways. They felt a lot of, once this door was open, they felt a lot of pressure to conform and not to be too visible as different. And so really, you really see the definition of Jewishness, at least publicly, heading more toward a religious definition, and that ethnic or racial language disappears from public view. Even it sort of goes underground. It doesn't really disappear, but it disappears from public view. And interestingly, you see a much more broad-based support among the Jewish population for African American civil rights. I think this is the period in the 50s and 60s where now, sort of like what happened with Rosenwald earlier, now that Jews had been more fully accepted, they adopted a kind of racial liberalism as a part of their broader identity. It was a way that as they integrated and became less different themselves, through racial liberalism, they hung on to a sense of being sort of white, but a different type of white, a way of being white that had resonances of their past as a group that themselves had suffered from exclusion and marginalization. And then, eventually what happens is the pendulum swings in the other direction. And I think after 1965, and increasingly toward the end of the 20th century, one of the main questions in the American Jewish community becomes no longer how can we fit in and be accepted as white, but Jews become so well integrated and so well accepted that they start to worry much more about how can they maintain a sense of their difference. And so I think in recent decades, what you see is Jews much more attracted to the idea of advancing, the notion that Jews are different, Jews are part, they want to be part of a kind of multicultural rainbow. And the whole idea of the Black-Jewish alliance and Jewish connections to African Americans in politics and culture become, in a way, more in vogue the more Jews feel that they're so integrated that they want to express a sense of difference. So this is, again, the idea that it's very messy. It's not this linear thing of going from being different to being similar, but as they become more similar, there's also this urge to be different.
That's really fascinating. Thinking about the present moment, or let's say maybe in the last 3 or 4 years, what about this sort of shift to whiteness, but also the rise in anti-Semitic violence? Can you speak to that?
Yes. Well, first, one thing I want to say is that the community, even, I presented this sort of as a shift, but I want to say that there's still a lot of division and that Jews are still not a monolith. So, this is, for example, this is a recent photo of Jews protesting the Muslim ban, and you see that there's this element of the Jewish community that identifies their own past as priming them to be sympathetic to the plight of minorities today. And so you're seeing this direct, and this happens to be the Muslim ban, but you could see similar types of protest in the wake of George Floyd's murder and many other things involving people of color. But then, I just want to remind you that this is Stephen Miller, right, is also a product of the American Jewish community. So there's still this spectrum, right, of people who can see Jewishness as informing a sense of empathy and relationship to people of color. But there's also obviously still this tendency of, wanting to fit in, being drawn more toward the, in the other direction of conformity to white racist discourses. Okay, so you asked about anti-Semitism. So this is Charlottesville 2017. So this is another complicating factor. There was this discourse that after World War II, anti-Semitism declined precipitously, which in many ways it did, but it didn't disappear from American society. And I think for many people, Charlottesville was a particularly jarring, for many Jewish people, it was a particularly jarring moment, because here was this incident that ostensibly was about Robert E. Lee statue being removed, and the alt-right demonstrators were coming, and so the framework was very much a black-white one. And then in the midst of this march, with the tiki torches, what they're chanting is, Jews will not replace us. And so I think it left a lot of people scratching their heads like, okay, how do these things fit together? One of the most perceptive, I think, commentators on this is Eric Ward, who's the head of the Western States Association on the West Coast. And he wrote a very interesting article, which you can find online. It's called Skin in the Game. And what he argued was that anti-Semitism is actually a key component of white nationalist ideology. The way he explains it is like this, that white nationalists, that recent US history kind of throws a wrench in white racist assumptions, right? Because if whites are superior to African Americans, how do you explain all the strides that African Americans have made, the fact that we've had a black president, it doesn't sort of fit the narrative, right? And so Jews, in those moments, it's sort of a moment of doubt, right, for a white supremacist understanding of the world. And so Jews are used as a convenient way of explaining that there's a sort of loose link within white society. And it must have been Jews who assisted African Americans and who are, through their backroom, dealings, are somehow messing with, what should be this very easy distinction between blacks and whites. And you also saw this in the Pittsburgh massacre, where there it was an issue of Latino, of Mexican immigrants, and the shooter being obsessed with the, Mexican immigrants are coming and replacing white people. And here too, the Jews were focused on as a group who were somehow aiding this process, right? So in this way, anti-Semitism becomes a kind of thread of helping to, explain this white racist worldview. And for this reason, Eric Ward says that Jews kind of have what he calls skin in the game, meaning that for this reason, they have a stake in fighting white racism, because it's also depends on anti-Semitism.
And I'm also thinking about how Charlottesville in this image complicates how we understand whiteness, Jewishness, and the place of Jews of color. So can you speak to that?
Yes. So, sometimes when I speak, I get a lot of questions because I'm talking about Jews becoming white. And one of the questions I often get is, well, but not all Jews are white. And today there's a substantial and increasingly visible population of Jews of color in the United States. Also Jews of color are taking more important roles in the leadership of the Jewish community. There are rabbis who are Jews of color and Hillel directors who are Jews of color. And so it's hard just to only talk about Jews as white. I'm a historian, and so while I do recognize that, and I think it's important to talk about it, and I'll say something about it in a second, but also I do think it's important to recognize historically that because the vast majority of Jews are of European background, I don't want talking about Jews of color to be a way of avoiding the history of how European Jews, sort of grappled with and became part of white America. So I don't, I want to talk about it, but I don't want it to kind of obscure that. Just as an example, I have here a picture of a guy named Rufus Perry. Rufus Perry was, so this is an example of a early Jew of color who became very famous in 1912. And his celebrity sort of shows how in 1912, a Jew of color was a very rare thing. And he was a son of a prominent Baptist minister in Brooklyn. I think they originally came from Kentucky. And he was prominent in political affairs. He was an attorney. And he fell in love with and married a Jewish immigrant woman from Poland, I believe. Her name was Lillian Bukacher. Bukacz is the name of a town in Poland, and I guess her family came from that town. And he became kind of a celebrity, and he was written up in not only Jewish newspapers, he changed his name, at least in the Jewish context, to Raphael Perry instead of Rufus, and he became circumcised, and anyway, but my point is that he was famous because it was such a rare thing. And then, if you fast forward to today, it's much more common, and this is a photo that's been circulated as part of discussions about Jews of color. I like that shirt. It says, "This is what Jewish looks like," right? Meaning that you can't assume any longer that Jews are white. For me, I think that this is a very important development, and it's my view that the racial hierarchy in the United States that organizes everything around black and white has been constricting for Jews in expressing Jewishness as a distinct identity. Like I said, that in order to be accepted as white, European Jews had to, in some ways, restrict their expression of Jewishness. They had to fit in, not be too different, narrow it only to a religious definition of Jewishness. So I think in that sense, whiteness and the need to assimilate into and be a part of whiteness has limited the possibilities for expressing a distinctive Jewish identity. So for me, the growing population of Jews of color in the United States opens up a new possibility for redefining Jewishness in a way that no longer has to overlap so neatly with whiteness, and that it opens up the possibility of understanding Jewishness in a way that doesn't always, collide with whiteness. So I think in that sense, not only is it important just for obvious reasons to be welcoming and to encourage the expression and the visibility and the leadership of Jews of color, because that's part of creating a diverse, humane community, but also that this process, will benefit everyone in the Jewish community, and frankly, the dismantling of structures of white racism will make it possible for people of all backgrounds to be able to express cultural diversity in a way where they're free of these pressures and restrictions.
And that's very well put, because my next question was going to be about Jewish people in the fight for racial justice. But I think you've answered it, but if you want to add more.
Well, I guess I would add that, as I said, there is a spectrum in the Jewish community today, and the full spectrum. But I think that, from my perspective, there are good reasons for Jews to fight against white racism and to help dismantle the system of white racism for the two key reasons. One is that anti-Semitism is a part of it, that it feeds anti-Semitism, and the two are linked, and you can't fight one without fighting the other. And B, for the reasons I've said, that it will open up the possibilities for a richer, more expressive type of Jewishness. And also, I would just say that Jews, I think, are very well placed to help in the fight of racial justice because many of them have access to positions within the white community, places of, positions of influence in politics, education, business. And so, they can be very successful as people, that they can do more than many other white people in addressing these issues. And they have a real role to play, I think, because of the positions in which they find themselves.
Well, thank you so much. I want to get a chance for the audience in person here, but also virtually, to be able to ask questions. So if we could thank Professor Goldstein for answering these questions. And this was super enlightening for me.
Is there a mic circulating? We have a question over here.
That was terrific. I thought it was
Thank
really
you.
interesting. But I had a question for you, which is that, I think Professor Goldstein and others have thought a lot about, all these distinctions, how Jews are seen and how we see ourselves. I'm wondering, in the African American community, as a historian going back to the 19th century, were African Americans aware of all of this? And then maybe in your own personal experience, to today, is this a conversation that Jews have with themselves? Or is it something that African Americans have, looked at and said, oh yeah, they're trying to work all this out?
That's a great question. I think, at least in my work on African Americans in the 19th century Northeast, I haven't come across many reflections on Jewish identity, but there is this concept of African Americans as being chosen people. And so that belief is reflected in a lot of the early African American newspapers written by African Americans. So I've seen that in the early 19th century in the Northeast. Presently, I don't know if I can answer that, but I don't know if Professor Goldstein, you have some insight.
Well, what I would say is, a lot of people have asked me, I talk a lot about what the white dominant population thought of Jews, and a lot of people have pointed out that I don't really talk much about what African Americans were saying about Jews, at least in the period before World War II. And my response to that is you have to recognize the power differential, and that as Jews were integrating into the white society, they were much more concerned with what members of the white dominant society were saying about them, and they weren't as concerned, they frankly weren't as concerned about what African Americans were saying about them, because they didn't perceive them as a powerful group. But then if you fast forward to the end of the 20th century, after the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans are taking a much more powerful role in a way of shaping the discourse about difference and race. And so I think today, Jews are much more focused on and concerned about the opinions of Jews in the African American community. But if you look back to 1910, they weren't so much.
I especially want to encourage students. There's, 1 and 2.
So my question is that after World War I, there's a lot of German nationalists believe in a myth called a stab in the back. So they believe that Jews are collaborating with socialists. That's why Germans lost. And do you think that, like, right now, the anti-Semitism movement in the States is linked with anti-socialist movement as well?
Yes, I mean, not exclusively, but what you're talking about is a kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And it could be socialist, but it could be lots of other things. It could be, like I said, helping African Americans. It could be, and this is where it's interesting, because anti-Semitism operates a little differently than, say, anti-black racism. It usually focuses on the idea that because Jews are conceived of as white, they kind of blend in, they mix with the dominant population, and yet somehow they're just operating covertly and doing things that undermine that society. And so this is a way in which anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily point to Jews. It's not Jews' difference that is at the center of these ideas, but it's the danger lies in their sameness, in their similarity. And it's when a society is looking inward and worrying about doubting their own stability. In other words, it's when the dominant white society, Germany's, it's different because Germany didn't have the same categories, but I still feel there's a similarity where anti-Semitism emanates from somewhat of a different set of circumstances, in that it's motivated by doubts that a society has about their own internal integrity, stability, dominance, and they're looking for a loose link within their society. And so Jews are a convenient scapegoat in that situation because they're similar. They're different enough to be labeled as different, but they're similar enough to blame for the problems of the dominant society. And so I think that's what you saw in Germany after World War I, but it also has resonances, like in our contemporary society. And that's where the idea of these conspiracy theories come in, where it's always like Jews somehow operating quietly behind the scenes, undermining the stability of the larger society.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much, Professor Goldstein, for your incredible insight and all of the information you've shared this evening, and Professor, for your incredible questions. Broaching the topic of Zionism, which hasn't really come up in this conversation yet, I'm from a very small Jewish community in a very conservative part of Florida, where a lot of my peers have really become activists in what they perceive as their own right upon going to university, and at University of Florida and some other places throughout the South, in response to the BDS movement. That's boycott, divestment, and sanctions, for anyone who's not familiar, against Israel. I come from like a very different perspective in that. But anyway, so a lot of that, as well as a lot of elders in my community, absolutely shut down the idea that they can be part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I've had a lot of conversations that go absolutely nowhere because they shut down as soon as they hear the words BDS, or very much associate the left with like radical anti-Semitism, kind of going the other direction. So do you have any insight or ideas of how to broach these conversations of whiteness and white privilege when people struggle so much with whether or not they identify as white, as Jews, and where our role comes in there?
Thank you. It's important, but it's a difficult question, and I don't want to say too much about Israel and Palestine and so on, because I'm an American historian and I don't have as much expertise on that. But I do think that there are some similarities between discussions of that issue and of Jewish identity in the United States. I guess what I would say is that it's very attractive for all of us to think in terms of dichotomies, right? And one of the things I've tried to do here is complicate the idea of a simple racial dichotomy where like everyone in society is divided neatly into a powerful dominant group and a marginalized, oppressed group. I mean, I don't want to discount, that there is truth to that, but I'm trying to say it's messier, and Jews are an example of a group that are very hard to categorize according to that neat dichotomy. And I think that you have the same situation in discussions of Israel, and I think that critics, there's a kind of neat dichotomy on the part of the critics of saying that, Israel is kind of an example of, white Western imperialism and so on. And they ignore the more complicated history of the Jews, of the Holocaust, but at the same time, there's also a tendency to, I think, to see it in simplistic, terms from the other perspective too. And I think one of the things in my work I try to do is to say to American Jews that it's important, even as we recognize anti-Semitism and the continuing vulnerability of Jews, to also think about the ways in which Jews in the United States do enjoy white many, European origin Jews enjoy white privilege, and that it's just more complicated. And one doesn't cancel out the other. In other words, you don't have to define someone, totally one way or the other, but to kind of think about the complicated story there. So I would just say that I think both of those settings have a very complicated story, and there are elements of where Jews have certain power and privilege, but there are also dimensions where they're vulnerable and they have a history of oppression, and you have to really grapple with the messiness of how those two things fit together, and that we can't just look for easy narratives and solutions to these things, but it's only through grappling with the complicatedness of it that you'll come, I think, to a better understanding.
Hi. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Okay. Thank you both for being here and talking on this subject. And a point that I think that has been brought up a couple times is that the conversations around anti-Semitism might not happen as much as conversations about other forms of hate and discrimination. But I do think that one context in which it can be brought up and has been brought up is with tensions between Israel and Palestine. And with social media, we did see a lot of conversations going on, and sometimes the people who were supporting Palestine kind of felt shut down in a way by people saying that that was a form of anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering, do you think that that is an appropriate context to kind of be throwing around these words, or what is your sort of reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of would answer it in the same way I just answered the last question, which is I think these are just very complex things, and I think that, you can't, it's not all or nothing. I mean, in other words, I think that I share the concern that sometimes anti-Semitism isn't taken as seriously, say, on college campuses. At the same time, I think that, we have to be careful about often there's a kind of competition, a feeling of that all types of, that we have to sort of paint all these things with the same brush. I think we have to understand the complicated nature of it. And I, like I said, I encourage American Jewish audiences that I talk to grapple with both the combination of often being a vulnerable minority, being subject to anti-Semitism, but at the same time, not letting that totally obscure the extent to which many Jews in the United States benefit from certain types of privilege and status. And so I just always think you have to, think about the way in this is a whole package of very complicated issues, and not just go to one or the other.
Hi. Yeah, so from what I understand, I guess like the history of all like the conspiracies against Judaism and all that, it has like a lot of roots in, I guess, like extreme interpretations of Christianity, it's like Jesus Christ, and then the fact of like usury being illegal in Christianity. So yeah, it kind of pointed to like Jews as like these bankers who take over money, like all these conspiracy theories. I guess my question is, do you think those roots still have an effect today with conspiracy theories, or has it kind of stemmed outside those religious connotations?
Yes, I think it's one factor. I mean, of course, there's a history of, what you're talking about, theological anti-Semitism going back to the roots of Christianity. What you see in the 19th century is anti-Semitism shifting somewhat away from religious means of expression and focusing more on scientific and racial ways of understanding the Jews, but in a way you couldn't, it's a kind of transformation, but there's still a thread of continuity. In other words, the fact that the Jews had been an outsider group and were religiously different informed the ways in which they came to be understood later as racially different. So I think it's one factor, but I also, part of understanding race as a social construction is that it doesn't just propel itself through history on its own, that there have to be social and cultural factors in each era that provide a basis for people finding these ideas attractive, right? So I think that it's not enough to look back and say, this is an old idea that's existed forever and it's just kind of been propelled through history. There must be things in our society. I think the same thing about racism in general, that it reproduces itself not just because it's this self-perpetuating thing, but because there are things in our society. There are societal problems, there are inequalities, there are social and economic anxieties that make it attractive for people to turn to racism or anti-Semitism. And so solving the problem isn't just about dealing with something that's come to us from the past, but it's thinking about what are the particular social, political, economic circumstances that are making these ideologies attractive. People don't, there are lots of things that exist from the past that people don't reproduce continually. And so I think we have to think about what's going on today in our society that makes it attractive for people to reach in and grab this thing from the toolbox and give it new life in our time.
We have a question from online.
Sure.
From our shared colleague, Professor Jenny Sartori,
Oh.
who wants to, and who sends regards.
An Emory graduate.
And wants to ask about the place of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews in this conversation about race. And as a translation, the Jews from large Jewish communities from North Africa, Morocco, the Iberian Peninsula.
Yes.
What about those Jews?
Excellent question. And sort of like Jews of color, Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews sometimes get lost in this larger history because they were a minority within the Jewish community. But there were especially parts of the country where they made up a significant grouping. So for example, in Atlanta, where I come from, there was a very significant sub-community of Jews from the Ottoman Empire. They mostly came from the island of Rhodes and different parts of Turkey. So for one thing, they suffered they sometimes faced additional challenges in coming to be seen as white because they were perceived as darker, they were perceived as, because they were Mediterranean, there were more questions raised about their whiteness, so especially in the Jim Crow South, you can imagine. And then, as a result of that, there was also a kind of internal Jewish discrimination against them. Not unlike the way the German Jews sometimes discriminated against Eastern European Jews, but then in turn, all of those Ashkenazic Jews, there was a kind of internal discrimination against these Mediterranean Jews. And it was shaped to some extent by these racial politics and fear that they were somehow less white than the European Jews, or they had a harder claim to make to whiteness. So that definitely was a factor.
Yeah, it's kind of the internal racial politics within communities. Yes. And listening to this conversation, which is so fascinating about the historical constructedness of race, with the example of Jewishness, really makes me want to ask you, Professor Baumgartner, if there's some way in which if there's some application here, the extent to which upward mobility and education and all of those factors determine one's racial self-presentation and understanding. How are there lessons for us or ways of applying this kind of analysis to the African American community? And I'm thinking of, when Barack Obama was first running for president, and there was all this conversation about, is he black? Not only does he have a white parent, he doesn't have a familial experience of the Black American variety of racial oppression. And yeah.
Well, actually, one of the first things that I'm thinking about are the controversial comments made by Sage Steele, who was a sports newscaster, and she was pretty derisive in describing that very problem, right? That Obama had to kind of explain that he is black, but didn't grow up with his black father, and instead his white mother and white grandparents. I think Barack Obama is sort of an interesting study in that sense, because he's not African American. I'm thinking also of just politics that are involved and the way one presents oneself. It's, as Professor Goldstein said, very messy and very complicated. Can you say more about what you were saying about education and?
I guess what I hear, that I don't know if I've heard it explicitly enough, but I'm inferring that the price of whiteness is a loss of empathy, a loss of identification with one's own history of, I don't want to say victimization because I don't want to privilege victim status, but recognition of the sufferings that one experienced because of a racial, or what was perceived to be a racial identity. And that part of the price is, or the cost is, that when you become white, you become, privileged in ways that put you in danger of a certain kind of callousness and loss of connection. And, so even as we struggle for that upward mobility, how are we mindful of the losses that come with it?
Would you say that that's the price of whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, the title is, partly it's a play on David Roediger's book, The Wages of Whiteness, but my intent was not to say that, Jews suffered and sort of for becoming white, as much as to sort of say what Lori's saying, which is, it comes actually, there's a statement by James Baldwin where he says that, in a way, he sort of feels sorry for those who became white because they lost something along the way. And it sort of goes back to what I was saying about how the structures of white racism constrict Jewishness to a certain box where there become only certain acceptable ways of expressing their difference, and that it silences and makes invisible and limits what are acceptable ways. I mean, I think there may be some parallels to politics within the African American community around things like passing and like Malcolm X expressing himself against certain like ways of trying to dress and wear one's hair like white people. So in other words, it's a similar thing in the Jewish community where it's sort of like the sense of loss of having to live a life where you're always trying to conform to some model of the dominant culture.
Thank you both so much for being here tonight. I guess my question is, I think that one of the things that America has been dealing with over the past year especially is just this recognition that a lot of people are coming to of how much how much like anti-Black racism is systemic in America. And so I guess I'm just wondering if there are instances of anti-Semitic racism that are like systemic that we might not think to look for or something like that.
Yeah, I'm thinking of education, if you want to say more about that in the 20th century of the quotas.
Yes, I mean, I think historically, absolutely, and there's a bit of a debate about this because a lot of the critics of whiteness studies have taken issue with describing groups like Jews and Irish as racial groups that only became white because they say, well, they were always white. And to some extent, that's true. In other words, even though Jews had an experience of maybe being provisional whites or having their whiteness questioned, there were some ways in which they always, for example, their citizenship was never questioned. The basic definition of citizenship that was established in 1789 or 90 was of free white persons being able to access certain rights like naturalization. And so in that sense, Jews have always enjoyed a certain access to like the legal definition of whiteness. But it's more complicated than that. And sometimes that's expressed as that Jews and these other immigrant groups were never subject to structural racism, that maybe social discrimination, not getting into a club or something. But I think that's not actually accurate. And I would say, especially in the interwar years of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, you can point to at least 3 things which I would call structural racism against Jews, which is housing discrimination. There were clearly neighborhoods where Jews couldn't live, and there were actually covenants and restrictions written into deeds saying, you know, this house shall never be sold to any Hebrew Israelite, along with, you know, African Americans, Asian Americans. They didn't use those terms. They used, you know, more problematic terms, and a whole laundry list of groups, but Jews were included and this was regional. It was in some parts of the country. So there was and sometimes it was just by custom. It wasn't written, but it was just known that, like, past this street, you know, no Jews are allowed to live. So you have housing, you have educational discrimination, which was rampant in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and in some cases up until the 1960s, where there were quotas against Jews. Jews were accepted to most institutions of higher learning, but there were often very specific limits on the numbers of Jews, you know, that were admitted to different schools. And then employment discrimination. So there were certain professions and jobs, I mean, that you can find advertisements now with keyword searching. You can find these things much easier than historians could 20 years ago, but you can find job ads that say, you know, Jews not need apply, or Gentiles only may apply. And, you know, there's, for example, a lot of Jews were school teachers in New York City, but they say that, as an example, they paid attention to their diction, and they had them read certain passages in English to see how they pronounced it. And if they had what was considered too much of a Jewish accent, like saying Long Island, then they couldn't get the job, right? So that wasn't like discriminating against all Jews, but you had to attain a certain level of assimilation. But there clearly, in the interwar period, were ads, you know, in newspapers saying Jews need not apply. So there was that kind of structural discrimination. I think that largely dissipated after World War II. I hesitate to say today that there are so many opportunities, and I think Jews kind of, you know, are disproportionately represented in so many of the central institutions of the United States, that I don't see many forms of structural discrimination against Jews today. But I do feel like there's some sort of structures in the way that we talk about difference and diversity, for example, that sort of aren't designed to include Jews. So I think that's one area in today's society where, you know, the way we talk about difference and diversity often isn't designed to include a discussion of Jews.
Here's another student question over here.
Is it on? There we go. First of all, thank you both for a great talk. So my question kind of concerns, you mentioned 2 kind of waves of immigration. One of like the 1840s and 50s of like German Jews, and then in the latter half of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century of kind of Russian and Eastern European Jews. And I'm curious, did these groups have kind of differing like religiosities in terms of like being more Orthodox or more Reform, I guess in modern terms? And if they did that impact their, I guess, either the speed or effectiveness or ease of their assimilation, and the way you put it, I think it was reconciliation, or I forget the exact word used, but with whiteness?
Yes, although contrary to kind of popular mythology in the Jewish community, those 2 groups were pretty similar in terms of their origins. When Eastern European Jews started to come in the 1880s, Jews from the German states had been in the United States for several decades. Sometimes there was already a 2nd or 3rd generation of American-born Jews. And in many ways, what was then a much larger immigration from Eastern Europe, like over 2 million Jews came between 1880 and 1924, was seen as possibly a threat to their hard-won status, because all of a sudden all these poor immigrants from Eastern Europe were coming, and they were afraid of being associated with them. But the truth, and so they sometimes held themselves up as more educated, more Reform, more you know, integrated into American culture, which they were, but that really didn't have to do with their origins. And their origins, they pretty much stemmed from a similar traditional society. They were were unemancipated before they had come to the United States in the 1840s and 50s. So those are differences that mostly grew up in the United States, and they had to do with several factors, which I don't want to go into too much detail, but the nature of the immigration were different. The earlier wave consisted mostly of young, unmarried men and women due to the particular problems that propelled them to come to the US. And America was not as industrialized when they arrived, and so they tended to spread out around the country, focus in mercantile professions, and because of that, they integrated fairly quickly into the larger culture. Fast forward to the 1890s, early 1900s, you have over 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe coming in much larger groupings. Because of the particular circumstances they were fleeing, they tended to come much more as family groups, multi-generational. Because America was now an industrialized nation, they tended now to settle in large urban centers where they worked in factory work. So you get these big Jewish enclaves in New York, Philadelphia, Boston. And so it's a much different setting for integration. They had their families around them. They weren't as spread out. They were in these big communities. So it was a much bumpier, longer path to assimilation and acculturation.
But yeah, growing up, I didn't necessarily, like, there wasn't a major Jewish community in the area, and I feel like until I got to college, I really didn't encounter any Jewish individuals or people who publicly identified as Jewish. So I'd be interested to hear your commentary about how Americans are educated about Jewish identity through education systems and the media. I particularly, like, my only understanding was the Holocaust and, like, the state of Israel until I got here. So I'd be very curious to see about how your opinion on how we're educating people on the Jewish identity through our public school systems and sort of media exposure.
Can I also comment too?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I just was thinking about this too. I'm from Los Angeles, California, which has a fairly sizable Jewish population, but I just remember in elementary school, especially, I guess almost around, what was it, like October, November, December, right? There would be a focus on religious holidays, right, toward the end of the year. And so we celebrated Hanukkah in school, right? We learned to sing, I Have a Dreidel, right? Those are things that we learned, and we were encouraged to learn it. We also learned about Kwanzaa, right, and other celebrations. But there was a way in which that was embraced, at least in where I grew up. And there was an appreciation there. So that was just my experience.
I think it probably is regional. And also I think it's changed over time, because my feeling is when I was growing up, I don't think Jews were ever mentioned in the public, truthfully, I don't ever remember learning anything about the Holocaust or the state of Israel when I went to public school in Maryland. But yeah, we did sing, maybe like we had a holiday concert and there was like one Hanukkah song, there was kind of a token representation, but not a very in-depth, discussion. But truthfully, I can't say that, except for in US history, learning about the Civil War and maybe the Civil Rights Movement, I can't say that there was a great curriculum about, any, about African American history either. So I think recently, schools have become more, and of course now there's controversy about the extent to which, in different parts of the country, schools can teach about race and diversity. I do think in general that like I said before, that Jews don't always fit into the way that race and difference and diversity is taught about and discussed, not only in schools, but in just sort of public discourse. But I think there's often a disconnect with the way that people actually experience their lives. And this is one of the things at Emory that I'm trying to raise consciousness about, because I think that there's sort of a template about the way we talk about difference and diversity, and there are offices of multicultural life on campuses, and they don't necessarily have a good way of talking about Jews. But then on certain campuses, like at Emory, there's a very large Jewish population, and I feel there's a disconnect between the way that this is talked about on an official level and the day-to-day experience where many students come to Emory and they have lots of Jewish friends, or they're coming from cities or places where they have Jewish friends. I teach a course, a survey of Jewish history. It's the kind of course that, say, a lot of non-Jewish students register for if they want to take one Jewish studies course and learn something about. And so we always ask the students, why are you taking this course? And so one student, for example, who was of, I think, Pakistani background, explained that he grew up in Great Neck, New York, and like lots of his friends were Jewish, and that from the age of like 12 to 14, he went to a bar and bat mitzvah every week, and that he kind of wanted to know like what all this is all about. And I mean, so it suggests that in his life, like Jewishness registered, it was important. He knew a lot of Jewish friends, but my sense is that there weren't a lot of resources in school or in public discourse to learn about this. So sometimes I think when you get to college, it's the first time there's even any resources to learn about it.
Hello. Thank you so much for your time. Both of you, by the way, are all like 4 or 5. There's a lot of people in here today. I just wanted to ask, because I know that someone had a question earlier about just like different analogies between anti-Semitism versus anti-Black racism, and how we're kind of now living under the assumption that it's probably best not to really draw those parallels. I'm asking this just because of when the Stop Asian Hate movement kind of came out. That, of course, is being compared again to anti-Black racism, and basically any marginalized group they compare their situations to anti-Black racism. So I guess I'm wondering why that was your choice. I do see, the history is racialized. But as for talking a little bit, I guess, more about in recent times, because you said, when I see anti-Black racism, I see it characterized as something very systemic, and you said in recent decades, I guess, that it hasn't been that way. Is there maybe a more useful comparison, like maybe like anti-Semitism to like Islamophobia or something like that?
Yeah. So I'm not comparing. I mean, in other words, I'm trying to steer clear of making those comparisons. That's why I didn't use the framework of Black-Jewish relations, because I think that creates the idea that there's some kind of even playing field or similarity in the historical experiences. And what I want to say is that all these groups have different historical experiences, and comparing them or putting them alongside of each other and saying all of them are the same, or all of these experiences are the same, isn't always helpful. And so I think we always, back to what I said about how racism gets produced in each generation by a particular set of circumstances and anxieties and trends in that society, and we always have to ask what's going on in that society that produces that. I think that a different set of circumstances produces different types of racism. In other words, I think that different set of circumstances produces anti-Semitism. They may be related, but like I was saying about Eric Ward talking about how anti-Semitism is a thread of white nationalism, but it's a very different thread than the anti-Black racism part. They may be mutually constitutive, like they support one another, or the same people spout them, but they emanate from different set of social anxieties. Like I said, anti-Semitism emanates from when white people feel that within their own society there's some kind of weakness and they look for a loose link. And that's different than some of the fears and things that motivate anti-Black racism. So I think it's just important to look at each group within their particular context and ask, like, what are the different circumstances that motivate anti-Asian racism, which might be different from, what motivates, they may be related in some way, but they're not all exactly the same. And so I think at the end of the day, as a historian, I always think you have to look at the social context and not just equate all of these things as if they're all, you have to say what's particular about each of these things. And that also means not that they're not like a ranking. but that they just are different, and it's important to understand the difference of each of these phenomena.
Thank you so much to you both. It was really a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Professor Baumgartner, for guiding it. I have many questions, but I want to take maybe the opportunity to prompt you to explain a particular part of the book that I think that the students might enjoy hearing about. Well, so Hanukkah came up, and this holiday around, and that's often in December, that has become a sort of, I suppose, a secular holiday in some sense that's acknowledged and discussed in schools. And I know that you don't, you're not looking at these questions from the perspective of Black-Jewish relations, but towards the end of the book, you do talk about how the changing sense of Jewish identity towards affirmation of a particular type of Jewish identity, and a discomfort with those.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Yes, you do. A discomfort with those who tried to hide that. And in your afterword, you illustrate this problem in a very entertaining way, which I think the students would really love to hear about.
Well, I think what Simon's talking about is, in the end of my book, I talk about the Adam Sandler Hanukkah song, which maybe some of you know of and don't know, but I was struck by this. It's not just a funny song, but I really think there was something interesting from a kind of identity standpoint to why he was so drawn to this process of, was essentially, there's three versions of the song now. What it essentially is outing, this is the way I see it, that he's mentioning all these famous people and kind of outing them as Jewish. And why it sort of works, or what's interesting about it, is that you don't know that these people are Jewish. So that there's a kind of passing going on. And it seems to me that he's both proud of the fact that they pass as white, that there are these influential people that everyone just thinks are generic, white celebrities. But then he takes a particular joy in outing them and claiming them as Jewish. And so I said that I think this is a kind of anthem for the contradictions of American Jewish identity, because it both satisfies the desire of Jews to be accepted and as contributors and members of the larger white dominant society, but at the same time it satisfies their desire to be different and to say there's something special and different about being Jewish, and he's able to kind of accomplish both of those goals at the same time. So when he says, one of my favorite lines, Michael Landon and Melissa I don't know if you know this show, Little House on the Prairie, but they're reruns. But he says, Michael Landon and Melissa Gilbert never mix meat with dairy. They should have called that show The Little Kosher House on the Prairie. So that's just an example, right, of this double move that he does. And I really think it gets to the contradictions of wanting to be both similar to the white majority, but also different.
It's so interesting that you draw attention to that line, which I didn't remember, because I'm just thinking now, I mean, here you have these, Jews playing whiter than
Minnesotan, white. Pioneering on the western frontier, right? What could be more white than that?
What could be more white than that? And the irony of now.
It's almost see, they tricked you, they're really Jews, ha ha. It's
right, they tricked you, they're really Jews, and now there's this push.
But isn't it great that they could pass for those people,
But ironically, at this very moment, there's this distress that non-Jewish actors are playing Jewish characters. And, I think to my way of thinking, there's something a little distorted about, asking for that kind of inclusion when so many successful Jewish actors, play non-Jews.
Right.
Yeah, so I think we're coming to the end of our hour. Are there any urgent questions in the room or anything? Famous last words that somebody, I know that's a hard position to put you in. I'm so grateful to both of you. I think there's something that happens, sparks in the brain when historians speak to one another about phenomenon that we take for granted as having a kind of eternal truth. And when we can see the extent to which identity categories are historically contingent, evolve over time. I mean, I'm reminded of a colleague of mine from many, many years ago at another institution who was remembering when he was a little boy in the rural, black child in the rural South, and he ran to his father to say that there was a white man at the door who was asking for Mr. Williams. Like, you know, no one had ever called his father Mr. Williams before. And he said, oh, no, he's not white, he's Jewish. So the idea that Jews were not white was just something they took totally for granted. Anyway, this leaves us so much food for thought. There are many important programs upcoming every week at this hour. With this class in the open classroom. I hope that people will continue to attend. It falls to me to just make special mention of the next program that is in the Ruderman series of the open classroom, and that will be on October 20th when we will be talking about the challenges of Asian American identities, and there are multiple Asian American identities, and that panel will include Rabbi Mira Rivera, who is, I believe, the first Filipina rabbi. So, you know, again, complicating this question of intersectional identities in the American context. So I will look forward to seeing you again at that occasion and at the other occasions of the seminar. I'm just wondering, Professors Kaufman and Landsmark, if there's anything you would like to share or add for your class, or then I get the privilege of, you are dismissed, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.